So as you might remember from the last video, we left off when I was trying on my stays for the first time. I just basted them together. I decided I wanted to take them in a little bit at the waist and out a little bit at the chest, as well as remove some boning from the front. So that's what I did. I picked them all apart, I made the alterations needed, and was ready to move on to sewing them together for real. I'm using what's called an English stitch to attach all the pieces, and as you might be able to tell, I had some help with this from my little naked kitty. Actually, his name is Stitch, so shouldn't come as a surprise. He's very interested in sewing. By the way, always make sure your handiwork is cat approved. This is very important. Is that right, Stitch? I think he approves. The English stitch is ingenious because it allows you to sew together all your pieces in one action, and it gives you a really nice seam as well that looks good from both sides. So what I've done here is I've cut away the seam allowance of everything except the fashion fabric and the innermost lining fabric, and then I've folded the fashion fabric and the lining fabric toward each other with the fashion fabric poking out about 1 millimeter, and I will now be sewing them together. And the way that you do this is by sewing through 2 layers of fashion fabric and 1 layer of lining, like so. And then you go over the edge of the lining you just stitched through, and you stitch through the same 2 layers of fashion fabric and the lining on the other side. Because it's a bit tricky to see, I'll show you from this angle as well. So I'm going through 2 layers of fashion fabric and 1 layer of lining, then over the edge of that lining and through 2 layers of fashion fabric and the lining on the other side. And it's not the quickest of stitches to make per se, but the fact that you can sew together 2 sets of lining and fashion fabric, as well as 2 pieces consisting of linings and fashion fabric in one action, makes it so quick. And this is the resulting seam, and it's quite flat once it's been pressed. It's very sturdy, as you can see. I'm pulling quite hard here, and it's quite neat, and also it's very sturdy, very shaping. It's almost like a piece of boning in its own right. In fact, the Norwegian word for the English stitch is a boning stitch. And the naked cat approves. One of the great things about whalebone, real as well as synthetic, is that it can be shaped using heat and moisture, steam, in other words. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to try and shape using my tailor's ham. That's basically just a pillow. It's got wool flannel on one side and cotton on the other, and it's stuffed with something durable and moisture resistant. And I'm placing it so that I can shape my stays to give a bit more shaping at the waist. I'm also going to try and shape the chest area, and the way that I'm doing it is I'm just using my iron with steam, going over the same area again and again, and shaping it with my hands where I feel like I need to do that, and pressing down, keeping it in shape until it's cool. And in theory, these boning should cool in place. Again, the cat approves. Different cat, same approval. The shaping at the chest needs to be done a little differently, or more correctly from the other side, because of the way the pillow shapes. So here I'm going to use a pressing cloth. I'm just using a kitchen towel, a clean kitchen towel, to protect my silk stitching and the cotton damask fabric. But it's the same theory, just going over with steam and heat, and keeping it in shape until it's cooled down. And you can see on the sides and the back of the corset it works. And the result is a pair of stays that will not lay flat, and that's just like the original garments.
I'm currently debating with myself because I've reached the point where I can start sewing the lining together, and as you can see I've already cut the lining. It's just plain white linen. However, it looks like I've cut my tabs in one. These little things here in one with the rest of my lining, but it looks as if on extant garments the tabs are usually lined separately, both when they've been lined in the same as the rest of the lining and when they've been lined in different material. Here it's lined in leather. So, and it's been, let's see, you see it's the same with this one. It's been lined separately from the rest of the bodice. So now I'm wondering, do I just keep going because I'm not actually an 18th century stay maker and I don't need to save on those tiny little bits of fabric, or do I cut these away? You know, just cut away here, start belining the separate tabs and then sew the lining over it? Or do I use some of the leather that I bought for this? Sorry, it's revealing my candy there. Do I use some of this leather that I bought for the edging? This is kid leather. For the edges, for the binding. Do I use some of that for binding my tabs?
Turns out my leather has some imperfections which makes this edge unsuitable for the binding, but fairly suitable for lining. So I ended up cutting the tabs off of my lining pieces, after having marked how high up they go, of course, so that I don't end up with about an inch of no lining at all. However, I did keep the back tab on the linen lining. That seems to have been done in the period as well. I then used my pattern and drew out some linings for my tabs. I then squared off the top of the tab lining and added some seam allowance all around. I gave myself 1 centimeter of seam allowance on the top of the linings and 1.5 centimeter around the sides, as I wasn't quite sure how much extra leather I needed to get around the tabs and fasten them to the front of the stays. Having made one lining, I then made a mirror lining and I numbered them so I would know which tab went with which lining. And sometimes it's important to just take a break, take some time from your work to scratch your cat and gently remove said feline away from the pattern piece you need right now. So to line and bind the tabs, I first removed some of the seam allowance around the edge of the tab, just to avoid the tabs becoming very bulky. I then whip stitched around the tabs. This seems to have been done in the period, and it makes sense because this is a part of your stays where they take quite a lot of stress, and you do not want boning poking out or fabric unraveling. After having done a couple of tabs, I realized that 1.5 centimeter of seam allowance was way too much, so I removed about 0.5 centimeter of seam allowance all around the tabs except the top edge. I then placed the lining, wrong sides together, underneath the tab and folded it over, beginning to create that binding. And I'm keeping it in place with these little clips. They are very handy. I also removed some of the, can you call it seam allowance when it's leather? I don't know. Just where it meets the last tab lining. And holding that in place with some clips as well. Of course, you can't pin into leather, it's a bit too thick, and also any pinpricks that you make will never go away, so using these clips is so much better. And this is how it looks when it's done. I've just clipped everything in place on the front side, and this is how it looks on the back side. It's the seam allowance of the tab linings that are turned to the outside of the stays and become the binding, and I'm just securing them with neat little whip stitches. Of course, they aren't quite as neat as I'd hoped for them to be. As you see, I had to sort of square them off. I was planning on the lining to just be turned around the sort of rounded shape of the tabs, but that did not work, which is the reason why I had to sort of square them off at the end. Square tabs is period correct, and I haven't seen a lot of people who've done square tabs on their stays, so I think I'm fairly happy with it. Happy enough to start with lining the rest of my stays. So I've just sewn the back and side lining pieces together with a running back stitch and pressed the seams open, and basted it around the neck edge and pinned it to the leather lining of the tabs. I've just folded the seam allowance in, and I'm whip stitching the linen lining to the leather lining. And this is how the stays look now. I've attached the two linings together, or I should say all the lining pieces together, and the tabs have enough room to bend, it's not too tight on them. I've basted around the neck and the armhole, and it's time to attach the front linings, and I'm doing it this way. I've sewn it to the front, and now these bones give a good shape to my stays. I want to help them by pulling my front lining a little too taut across the chest. This was done in the period. You can actually see extant stays with a bit wonky front linings where they've been sewn to one side and then pulled across. So that's what I've done. I've pulled it across, I've pinned it in place, folded the raw edges in, and I'm just whip stitching it down. While doing this and looking at my tabs, I started thinking, and then thinking some more, and then my progress just ground to a halt. I've done a lot of thinking. I lay awake last night actually thinking, and I've done some work in my winter garden today. And I think I've had a change of heart. I'm just not happy with my tabs. I've tried to flatten them using a hammer, which works. They're a bit flatter now, but I can't love them. I mean, they look chunky and wonky and they're not very neat. It would have been different. Like, I've tried to tell myself, you know, but square tabs, that's cool. Not a lot of people do that. It's a circle. And it is, but it would have been different if I'd meant for them to be square instead of being a way to solve a problem I did not foresee. So I have a few options to fix it. I can remove the leather lining and replace it with a different kind of material, linen or cotton or something, and then just bind the tabs as along with the rest of the stays. I don't really want to do that. I'm really happy with my leather bound tabs. They are very soft and it's very sturdy. Another option, of course, is to remove the leather lining, cut new linings that go, because I've seen that on some Mexican garments that go over the entire tab and are sewn together at the back. I'm not sure I have enough leather, and this is leather that I bought in a Viking festival last summer. I know I won't be able to get the same kind of leather. I probably won't even be able to get similar kind of leather because all those markets where I usually meet people who sell this are of course cancelled due to the pandemic. So I don't have enough leather to do that, I think. I can remove the lining, recut the lining, recut the tabs so that they are actually square and redo the lining. Is a possibility. I think what I'll probably end up doing is to cut away the outer sort of where the leather is folded in, and just round the leather lining to match the tabs, and then bind them along with the rest of the stays. I'm not positive that's something that would have been done in the period. I've been looking up extant stays. That's part of what I spent last night doing. And some of them, I found this one that's got a seam. It looks like it's got a seam around the edges, and the edges are leather lined and leather bound. So that they might have done that. I'm not sure. I can't really tell from the pictures, but I think maybe something similar can have happened to that pair of stays. And this is an experimental pair of stays, so it's not supposed to be smooth sailing, I guess. So that's what I'm gonna do. That's nearly 7 hours wasted on doing my bound leather lining on the tabs. Well, not wasted, because you learn, don't you? But I need my stays to be done by the end of the week. But it's only Monday today, so there's still hope. While contemplating my tabs, I decided to attach my shoulder straps. And the way I decided to do this, I have absolutely no evidence for, and I could not find any evidence on how straps were attached in the period. But the way I've decided to do it is to take my straps that consist of fashion fabric, interlining and linen lining, and backstitch the fashion fabric and interlining to all layers of the stays. When that's done, I cut away a little bit of the seam allowance, both to avoid bulk, but also to even them out so that they are the same length. I then made some prick stitches, or a combination of prick stitches and whip stitches, where I whip stitch over the raw edges and then make a tiny little prick stitch on the right side, the outside of the stays. And I'm hoping this will give me very sturdy and stable shoulder straps that can take a beating. That being done, I smooth my linen lining down over the raw edges. I folded up the seam allowance to remove any raw edges, and just whip stitched it to the lining of the stays. These are the finished straps from the inside and from the outside. They look a little wonky, but that'll probably be smoothed out when I iron it down. A lot of extant garments seem to have a small pocket in the stomacher of the stays, so I wanted to recreate that. I thought it'd be a nice place to, keep a love letter or maybe a watch, but apparently they were used for fragrant flowers and herbs that would rest close to your heart and make you smell nice. So I just made a little pocket. I attached it to the inside of the stomacher lining, and I'm pretty happy with it. All pieces having been lined, it's now time to bind them. The way I do this is by first removing some of the seam allowance to avoid bulk, and I then stretch my leather binding and hold it in place with more clips. Leather is nice because it's a bit stretchy, especially when it's this thin, so you don't need super straight edges. You can utilize parts of the leather that would have been unusable had it been fabric instead of leather. I then whip stitch along the edge, stitching through all the layers, so all the layers of the stays or the stomacher, as well as the linen lining and the leather binding. This takes time and muscle, incidentally. Now all the edges have been whip stitched, it's time to fold the binding towards the inside, and this is a bit tricky around corners and inside corners, but if you stretch it and fiddle with it and manipulate it a bit, you'll get there. So just folding everything into the inside, making a nice neat little rounded edge, and holding it in place with more clips. Everything clipped and secure. This is how it looks from the outside, and this is the inside. And now's the time to whip stitch your leather binding to the lining layer of the stays or the stomacher. Try only to catch the topmost lining layer, although I don't think it'll be possible for my stitches to be seen from the outside, considering how many layers of fabric and paper and boning is between me and the outside of the fabric. And it's all done! Ladies and gentlemen, I did not film making the eyelet holes. I will link to my chemise video where I showed you how I make eyelets or lacing holes. but I'm pretty darn pleased. I decided to cut away and rebind my tabs, and I'm very happy that I did, because now they look very neat and rounded and elegant and on purpose. And it's not easy to see here, but I've actually made the boning channel for the front boning by folding all my extra seam allowance in, creating the boning channel, but it's all covered by the leather binding, but that's how it was done in the period. As you can see, I've tried to strengthen the splits between the tabs a little bit. Hopefully that'll work. That's a stress point, and it's quite a nice shape to it all. Even when I folded out the boning, and the tight lining will not make it lay flat. And here's my stomacher done, full of elegant seaming down the center, all bound in leather like the stays are. And if we look inside, it's a bit curved, and you can see the pocket. I'm really happy with this pocket. It's such a cute little detail, and I'm just looking forward to using it for, you know, coins and love letters and secret spy notes. Let's see how it all looks on, shall we? So finally, after 137 hours, I'm done. I'm super happy with these. They fit really well, they're very comfortable. I'm super happy that I got the right rounded chest shape that you see in extant garments and in portraiture from the period. So I'm just super happy. Material wise, they cost me about 800 Norwegian kroner. That would be in excess of 80 quid pound. And as an added bonus, the green color is really beautiful and spring-like, and it's been really nice and very uplifting to work with something of this color. So I'm very happy, and I've now got my shift, I've got my stays, I've got hoops, and I've got a false rump, and I'm finally ready to start working on some more sort of outerwear. So come back for that. In the meantime, be kind, be creative, stay safe, and come back.